Welcome, friends, friends of the Congo, friends of African liberation, and friends of justice for all. We are honored today to come together to mark the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, along with his loyal cabinet member, Maurice Mpolo, who was the Minister of Youth, and Joseph Okito, the first Vice President of the Senate. These three African patriots were martyred on January 17th, 1961, as they attempted to set their young nation on the path towards self-determination. We come together today knowing that our continued control by the forces of colonialism, enforced by African presidents for life and Western corporations, must be challenged. But we know that any challenge to oppression must be equipped with a clear understanding of the historical, political, economic, and cultural forces at work. We have enlisted three world-renowned scholars on the history of the Republic of Congo, the political career of Patrice Lumumba, his assassination, and their importance to friends of the Congo, friends of African liberation, and friends of justice for all. Our three panelists are Dr. George Nzongola-Ntalaja, Dr. Ludo De Witte, and Dr. Ira Dworkin. I will introduce them fully as we begin the program, but we'll wait for that. So we salute these three scholars who have joined us today for their commitment and willingness to serve when called upon. Right now, we want to begin by actually having a reading of an appeal to establish a Lumumba Day as a general recognition within African American and allied social areas. So before we begin the program, we want to honor the lives and the work of Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito. We members of Friends of the Congo and our allies call for the universal recognition of the significance of these three martyrs by establishing January 17th as a day of reflection and work to make real the legacy of Patrice Lumumba. Sister Sarah Bell will read our proclamation, and immediately afterward, our panel discussion will begin with an introduction of our panelists. We will conclude with questions from the audience. Thank you everyone for joining us. Sister Sarah, are you here? Are you ready?
I'm here, I'm ready.
Thank you.
On the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, Congolese Pan-Africanists and people of goodwill throughout the globe have launched a campaign to declare January 17th as Lumumba Day. Colonial and imperialist forces in cahoots with Congolese elites conspired to overthrow and subsequently assassinate Congo's first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Emery Lumumba. Lumumba was singled out for particular brutal and pernicious murder. He was gunned down by a firing squad, followed by the dismemberment of his body, which was later dissolved in acid. One of the Belgian soldiers responsible for dissolving Lumumba's body parts took one of his teeth as a trophy. The intent of the forces involved, such as Belgium, United States, and the United Nations, was to erase Lumumba and the leadership of his nationalist and Pan-Africanist government from memory. Generations later, Congolese youth, Africans, Pan-Africanists, working class folks throughout the globe, and people of goodwill have declared that Lumumba's physical body was distinguished, but his ideas, teachings, and spirit will live forever. Lumumba's call for self-sufficiency, self-determination, and African liberation has been embraced by a new generation of Congolese and Africans. We appeal to justice-seeking and peace-loving people throughout the world to commemorate January 17th each year as Lumumba Day by taking any or all of the following actions. A, securing a resolution from your organization or government declaring January 17th as Lumumba Day. B, screening a film on Lumumba. C, sharing information about Lumumba on social media. D, participating in a Lumumba commemoration event. E, supporting Congolese and African youth carrying on the Pan-African ideals and legacy of Lumumba. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Sarah. I appreciate the appeal, and I think we will have people around the planet joining us. And I do appreciate your work. We're looking forward to you taking over Friends of the Congo Atlanta and leading us in a great direction. Thank you, sister.
Thank you.
Okay. We will begin now with our panel. And I want to introduce, it's always difficult to introduce such an illustrious panel because we could really take about all day going through the CVs of scholars like Dr. George Nzongola-Ntalaja and Ludo De Witte and Ira Dworkin, but we won't do that. So we will give a brief introduction. Dr. George Nzongola-Ntalaja is a professor of African and Global Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A political scientist by training, he has spent much of his academic career in interdisciplinary studies. Former president of the African Studies Association of the United States and the African Association of Political Science. He is the author of numerous publications on African politics. He also served in the United Nations Development Program as a senior governance advisor to the federal government of Nigeria, director of the Oslo Governance Center, and facilitator of the establishment of the African Governance Institute. His book, The Congo from Leopold to Kabila, A People's History, won the 2004 Best Book Award from the African Politics Conference, and his book, Patrice Lumumba, a pocket biography in the Ohio Short Histories of Africa series, is taught at Morehouse College, among other places, as a part of the Congo curriculum. So we welcome you, Dr. Nzongola. We'll introduce our other panelists, and then we'll go directly into questions from our panelists. Dr. Ludo De Witte is a Belgian sociologist, historian, and writer internationally known for his book, The Assassination of Lumumba, one of the most comprehensive texts on the murder of Patrice Lumumba to date. His follow-up book, L'Ascension de Mobutu, chronicles the rise, and pardon my non-existent French, chronicles the rise to power of Joseph Mobutu in the post-Lumumba climate, including the roles that Belgium, the US, and the UN continue to play in shaping the situation in their favor. He is also the author of Le Capitalisme contre le Climate, and the English title, When the Last Tree is Cut Down, We'll Eat Our Money, Capitalism Against the Climate, in which De Witte promotes eco-socialism, stating that to save the world from ecocide, we must free it from the yoke of capitalism. De Witte advocates for the study and practice of social ecology, which incorporates politically left social and economic structures with environmentally conscious policies to challenge capitalism and restore a healthy relationship with nature. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ira Dworkin, an associate professor of English at Texas A&M University and a 2020 to 2021 American Council of Learned Societies Burkhardt Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. His work examines the transnational political histories of African-American literature and culture. He is the author of Congo Love Song, African-American Culture, and the Crisis of the Colonial State, which was a finalist for the Pauli Murray Book Prize for the African-American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Dworkin earned his PhD at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship at the Université de Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo and served as Associate Director of the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Excuse me. He is the editor of Daughter of the Revolution, the major nonfiction works of Pauline E. Hopkins, and the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. So please join me in welcoming our three panelists. And we will begin with one general question for our three panelists, taken in order from Dr. Nzongola, Dr. De Witte, and then Dr. Dworkin. And then we'll have three questions, a series of questions, short questions for each of our panelists. The question, we want to begin our discussion today with this idea and facing the rising authoritarianism that we see around the globe. We see in the United States, of course, the attempt of the Trump administration to hold on to power and to overthrow a democratically elected president, largely by discounting and devaluing the votes of African Americans. We see in Uganda the continued hold of power. But if we think about the legacy of Patrice Lumumba, what is that political legacy? And of Lumumba, but not just of Lumumba, but also of the Mouvement National Congolese, the MNC. What is that political legacy for us today? And if we could have just a brief response. Dr. Nzongola, if you begin.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Friends of the Congo for organizing this tribute to Patrice Lumumba and for inviting me to take part in the discussion. The major legacy of Patrice Lumumba is the unity of the Congo. I remember a couple of years ago, there were two scholars, one American, one South African, who wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine saying that the Congo does not exist. And there was a reply by an American woman who wrote that, no, the Congo exists. Why? Because over 70 million Congolese, now we're talking about over 80 million Congolese, believe in it. This is one of the major legacies of Patrice Lumumba, but there is an overwhelming commitment to national unity in the Congo. Some politicians may talk about secession, but they're simply talking in a desert because no one is going to listen to them. The people of the Congo are great, whatever, we have over 250 ethnic groups, and yet we find there is total commitment that we should not have a balkanization of our country, that we should stick together. Lumumba started that process in 1958, when with a number of Catholic intellectuals in Kinshasa, they created the Mouvement National Congolais, the Congolese national movement. This was the first national political party in the country because the Belgians had not allowed the Congolese to have political parties. The organizations that existed were mostly ethnic associations. You find these in many African cities during the colonial period, but people would unite because they came from the same area, the same ethnic group, and so on and so forth. Most of these were mutual help associations to help people in time of funerals, in time of joy, in terms of weddings and celebrating newborns and so on and so forth. But when Lumumba started the MNC, the National Congolese Movement, it was quite a very, very, very unique, innovative achievement because most of the parties existing then were just these ethnic associations transformed into political parties. In this movement, Lumumba spent all his time to build it across the entire country, beginning of Kinshasa, then his Kisangani, then known as Stanleyville, which used to be his major fief, because he had spent 12 years as a civil servant working in the postal service in Kisangani. And so the party became a party, but really got the plurality of votes during the national elections of May 1960, and was therefore able to form a coalition government with other progressive parties like the Parti Solidaire Africain of the late Gizenga and Pierre Mulele, or the Sereya of Kashamura from Kivu province, and some other smaller parties. This was a very good signal to the Congolese people. But if we want our country to go forward, we should concentrate on building the country instead of dividing ourselves into quarrels based on ethnicity or based on regionalism, like people like Moise Chombe in Katanga, who became really a stooge of white settlers and the Belgian government to proclaim the secession of Katanga, as Professor De Witte has shown very, very well in his excellent book on Lumumba's assassination. The Katanga secession was un état d'opérette, a kind of a caricature of a state, because it was basically run by the Belgians. It was not run by the Congolese. So Lumumba has to be really credited to that. And the second point is that Lumumba wanted to use the resources of the Congo to develop the Congolese society, the Congolese economy, and to improve the livelihood of Congolese people. This was anathema to the corporate giants who control the Congo, like the Société Générale de Belgique, whose subsidiary, Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, was really a state within a state. This was the mining company that controlled much of the economy of the Congo. They did not want this to enjoy the wealth of our own country. They want to continue plundering our country for the benefit of others rather than the people of the Congo. And this is one of the major reasons why they did not like to have Lumumba as prime minister. They had to get rid of him.
Thank you, Dr. Nzongola. Your enthusiasm, I know you have more material saved for us for your specific questions, but I take that general message that Patrice Lumumba's legacy is one of national unity and using the resources of Congo for Congolese people. Thank you. Dr. De Witte, if we could ask you, what do you see as the legacy? And I when you write these questions, you try to be in some ways very specific, but general enough so you can open things up. So if we say political legacy, feel free to walk through any other areas that you might see as the legacy of Lumumba and the MNC.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me in this important conference. I will be very brief. I think there are a lot of lessons which sums up the legacy of Patrice Lumumba, but maybe one of the most important is that when you want to have democracy, sovereignty, it's important to change the relationship of forces. Democracy is a formal shell which has to be given flesh and blood, which has to be getting concrete, and which has to be protected, defended against forces you just want to take away this sovereignty. This is what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said. How is it possible that Patrice Lumumba, with his very moderate social economic program, has been considered a comrade in arms by Frantz Fanon and considered as a deadly enemy by the Société Générale, which is the colonial holding, the Belgian colonial holding, who controlled a lot of the wealth of the Congo. And this lesson that democracy is more than just democratic institutions is a lesson for which Lumumba himself would ultimately pay with his life. And he had to experience that lesson. So when in 60, in September 60, he was deposed as a prime minister by the president Kasavubu, which was an illegal deposition. Kasavubu, who was protected by blue helmets, with money from Belgium and United States flowing into the Congolese army, just to have that Congolese army units were taking sides with the coup and against Lumumba. Well, Lumumba went to parliament. He gave a magnificent speech. A majority of the parliament supported him, and he went home. He thought, this is democracy. I have the majority on my side. But in the meantime, on the ground, secret agents, money was being flown in. There were terror squads which were organized to terrorize Lumumba supporters. And the fact that the relationship of forces on the ground weren't worked at that moment meant that the coup succeeded. And this was something which Lumumba was a genius, someone who was completely self-educated, but he was learning extremely fast through this crisis, and he would very quickly learn that he had to react, and he would, a few weeks later, he would try to escape from the capital and try to reach his supporters in the east of the country, trying to take back the sovereignty which had been stolen by the people who organized the coup. I think that's a very important lesson which we have to keep in mind, and which is very relevant for today. If we want to change something in the direction of democracy, we have to fight, we have to see that the population is mobilized just to protect all those advancements we can make.
Thank you, Dr. Witte. I appreciate that. The arrangement of forces has to be dealt with, and just like you said, Patrice Lumumba paid with his life to teach us that lesson. But we'll revisit and go more in depth in just a minute or two. Dr. Dworkin, if you could briefly tell us, what do you see as the legacy of Patrice Lumumba and the MNC, or I know your research is from the 19th century into to the more so in the 20th century. But what do you see as that legacy?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Friends of the Congo for this. It's a real honor to share space with my fellow panelists and everyone who's with us today on this Lumumba Day. And in terms of this question, there's a number of things that I've been sort of thinking about recently about the legacy. I mean, one is if we think about Lumumba's famous Independence Day address, and one of the statements that he made quite famously in that address is that we cannot forget colonialism, that we can never forget it, right? And so this is, I think, such an important reminder that colonials are going to colonize. That's what they do. That's what they've continued to do. And that's why many of those struggles remain ongoing 60 years later. You know, in a sense, if we think about, you know, particularly what's going on in the United States today, you know, there's calls for different forms of kind of bipartisanship or sort of letting bygones be bygones. But certainly Lumumba was someone who understood at that very particular moment the importance of accountability as one of the ways of redressing that. You know, another thing that's really been on my mind during this time, of course, is Malcolm X's famous statement following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This was in response to a question he received after a lecture that he delivered on December 1st, 1963, when he famously said that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. It's an incredibly famous statement in Malcolm's career. It began the sort of formal severing of his relationship with the Nation of Islam. But part of the analysis, the longer analysis that Malcolm said in that, he says that this is sort of the outcome of the US involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. It's something he repeated on multiple occasions particularly during the final sort of 18 months of his life when the Congo became quite central for Malcolm. And I think part of what, the legacy there is a particularly important kind of reminder that there's an inseparability between the local and global forms of politics. And that's something that Malcolm's a reminder of, and sort of Lumumba's legacy is central. I mean, Malcolm sort of during that final year, as he was organizing outside of the Nation of Islam, took Lumumba as the sort of patron saint of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He named one of his daughters in memory of Nasser and Lumumba as well. And then there's another sort of thing, which I maybe will just mention briefly, and the expectation that probably we'll be able to talk about it a little bit more. I think there are kind of diasporic organizing an organizational legacy that I think we want to, think about thoroughly as well. And so sort of beginning with campaigns against Leopold and Belgian colonialism, against the arrest and imprisonment of Lumumba, and ultimately the assassination of Lumumba, and what we see emerging out of those in terms of collectivities and organizations and movements and campaigns and things that really sustain themselves. If we're thinking about Lumumba, really throughout the 1960s in ways that were transformative of Black culture in the United States and diasporically. And I think really continue to shape the kinds of conversations even that we're having here today.
Thank you, Dr. Dworkin. I appreciate that. So let's go back to Dr. Nzongola. And Doc, I want us to think about the situation that we find ourselves in today, where we do see, not so much, I wouldn't say generalized interethnic conflict, but enough hotspots to make it problematic to have peace, troublesome to actually have peace. Would you say, and I'm asking this question as an informed neophyte, was Patrice Lumumba's MNC a model for transcending interethnic conflict in the Congo and Africa generally? And if you could note, when you do that, any successful and unsuccessful strategies that the party might have undertaken.
Before answering that, let me go back to the first question to say the one aspect of Lumumba's legacy we didn't mention is his Pan-Africanism. When you travel all over the African continent, one of the things you notice that Lumumba's name is on streets, sometimes parks and buildings all over the African continent. Whether it's in Egypt or in Kenya or in Mali. Actually, in Mali, there's even a huge monument of Lumumba in the center of the city, alongside other great African heroes. Lumumba was extremely committed to Pan-Africanism. This started with his participation in the All-African People's Conference of December 1958 in Accra, where he met Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and some of our great liberation leaders such as Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, Dr. Moumier from Cameroon, and many others. And as a matter of fact, in August of 1960, during the midst of political crisis, Lumumba went ahead and convened a conference, a Pan-African conference in Kinshasa, attended by foreign ministers of many countries, especially the progressive countries, and where he made it very clear that he did not think that the independence of the Congo would mean much if the rest of Africa would remain in bondage. That the Congo was going to be committed to basically repeating what Kwame Nkrumah had said in 1957 when Ghana became independent. So that is one. Now, when we come to the MNC, unfortunately, the MNC disintegrated after Lumumba's death. It was not the people who succeeded him, people like Antoine Gizenga and others, were not really committed nationalists. These were opportunists. We saw that during the so-called rebellions or the popular insurrections for second independence from 1963 to 1968. We had the two theaters of that insurrections in the Congo. The East, where Gubenye was the leader with Laurent Kabila and others, and in the West, where Pierre Mulele was the leader. And we see that of all of his leaders, Pierre Mulele was the only true Lumumbist, one who was really committed, had steadfast commitment to liberation and to improving the lives of the people. Well, in the East, the Gubenye and others, all they wanted was, once they took over a city, whether it was a district capital or the provincial capital, the first thing is to move into the palace, which used to be occupied by the Belgians, to find out where the gold is, where the money is, and to live well, life like kings and princes. While Mulele remained in the village, even when he took a town, in the Kwilu province, for example, he wouldn't move and take over. So this was an indication of the Lumumbism, which is what I called a Lumumbism on paper, or Lumumbism of parade, is true Lumumbism. So true Lumumbism is now very, very weak in the Congo, unfortunately, because of all the predatory states we've had since Lumumba's assassination, the Mobutu system, followed by Laurent Desire Kabila and his son, Joseph Kabila, who created states but were there simply for the self-enrichment of the rulers. And this is also something we are seeing all over Africa. It's not only in the Congo, because now you see South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Angola. These are countries that came to independence through armed struggle, with liberation movements proclaiming Marxism, Leninism, socialism, and so on. And yet who today are creating millionaires, who today are allowing the Chinese to cut out trees, to make Namibia, which is a very desert country. The few trees there are being cut off there, and who are not really concerned with the plight of the people in South Africa today. The 20% of the population controls 70% of the wealth. That is exactly the ratio it was during the apartheid period. The only difference today being that within the 20%, you have black billionaires and millionaires. But the majority of the population remains very, very poor. So this is a great indictment of liberation movements, which I, as a scholar, but committed to activism and liberation, cannot resist from denouncing. But the point is that the assassination of Lumumba really weakened revolutionary forces in the Congo. Those who tried, of course, were also defeated because of the counterinsurgency by the United States, Belgium, and their allies in the international community. So this is so I cannot say much in terms of, but of course, but the idea of a national party is an excellent idea. And it's one, but as you can see, all over Africa, many governments are seeing the advantage of doing that because it helps to develop national unity.
Okay. Dr. Nzongola, you've, I knew you would do this, but you basically deconstructed my second question in your introduction, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case if you just want to say anything that you wanted to reinforce. But sure. Given the fact that Lumumba was only able to hold power for a few months, do we really have the full functioning and history of his political philosophy? And if yes, I'll just say that.
Yes, no, the political philosophy is well known. I mean, Lumumba, as you know, grew up in a country where, for example, progressive literature was banned. We were not allowed to read the communist and socialist literature. For example, Lumumba didn't know what Marxism-Leninism was, except what we heard from Catholic priests who were denouncing it as evil, But he was a nationalist who was so intelligent that even though he did not even finish elementary school, he was a self-taught person. For example, he passed the exam to be admitted to a postal school in 1947. And this is a school where people who have done secondary school were enrolled. But he had to pass an exam to be enrolled in that school. And after a year, when there was a school for 1 year, he graduated he was the third among a class of some 37 students. He came out third, again indicating how intelligent he was. He's a person who read everything he could find. When he was working in Kisangani, he even worked voluntarily in the Black Township Library to be able to improve his knowledge. And he ordered books by correspondence. He knew some philosophy and politics, history, and so on. So Lumumba's philosophy was basically nationalism, the idea that all people are equal, that there have to be equality, there have to be justice, there have to be equity. Was a person who wanted a government that was a national government committed to working for all the people, not discriminating between ethnic groups or provinces or regions and so on. Was a person who was committed to determined for national sovereignty, to be the owner of our country and its resources, and who was committed to the idea of building the economy to eradicate poverty and to make life better for our people, and wanted also to see African governments come together to promote inter-African cooperation, African economic integration, because he knew very well that with also many countries, our continent balkanized in over 50 countries, we could not develop singly. The only way to develop in Africa was through unity. And this is some of the ideas that he was, so this is what I would consider to be Lumumba's political philosophy.
Thank you, Dr. Nzongola. We're going to move to Dr. De Witte, and you know that I know there are so many markers that could be picked up in terms of continuities, but Dr. De Witte, if you could take us back to the opening of the 1960s and this period that was just pregnant with the possibilities of African liberation, and if you could discuss the political climate and the motives that led to the overthrow of the MNC and, of course, Patrice Lumumba.
You know, generally it's been said that Lumumba's fierce speech on Independence Day signaled his death warrant. That international and especially the political class didn't accept it, what he said there. It was surely a non-diplomatic speech, which was an answer to the paternalistic speech of the Belgian king. A speech by the king which tried, in a sense, to hijack Independence Day from the Congolese people. And that was something which Lumumba couldn't accept. He wanted to put the Congolese people central into that Independence Day as a starting point for a mobilization after independence. The real reason why the Congo crisis broke out and Lumumba was deposed is elsewhere. Actually, the Belgian elite never wanted to give up the Congo. The Belgian elite was extremely small, weak, divided, stubborn, narrow-minded, and I compare it a bit to a child who receives by accident a very big gift and don't want to give it back. The Congo fell into the hands of the Belgian elite after the death of King Leopold II, who in a sense went for a colony all by its own against the intention of the Belgian elite, which was very fearful that this would provoke very heavy reactions especially by the French and the English. And it was only when it became clear that the wealth of the Congo was so big that Belgian elite jumped onto the occasion to exploit the thing. And just to give an example how the Belgian elite didn't want this independence is that a few years before independence, a Belgian professor wrote a small article in a theoretical review saying maybe we should give a very limited independence within 30 years to the Congo. This provoked a huge outcry in Belgian elite circles with demands to depose this professor of his post at the university, just to say how stubborn the Belgian elite was. They weren't prepared, they didn't want to prepare not independent. And that was the problem. You never had the development of a kind of a national elite, national Congolese elite, which could take over the reins of the country after independence, which would be a very conservative elite, which would tolerate that in the shadows, Belgium would continue to control the massive wealth, the exploitation of the wealth of the Congo. And the reason that finally went to the astonishment of the Belgian elite, Lumumba won the elections. At that moment, Belgium was thinking that they could keep in check the Lumumba government because the Congolese army was the colonial army transferred to the Congo intact. And this was an army which was modeled on the apartheid system. All the soldiers were black, all the officers were white, were Belgian, were conservative, educated into the royalist tradition. And that was what the minister of the Belgian Congo said: thanks to the Congolese army, I'm not afraid for independence. And what happened after independence is that when the Congolese soldiers wanted the independence to become concrete, they wanted to have promotions, they wanted to have also black officers. You got a mutiny of the Congolese army, and Lumumba decided to Africanize this army. And this Africanization broke the back of this colonial army. And at that moment, Belgium was taking away the instrument to keep under control the Congolese government. And that was the moment when it has been decided to do away with Lumumba and to have him deposed.
Right. Thank you, Dr. De Witte, excuse me. But if you could go and talk about the, in addition to the specific move of Africanization of the army, what role do you see in balance? The United States, Belgium, but then also these African factionalists that Dr. Nzongola spoke to in terms of breakaway governments, not the Mulele governments, but those Katangan forces. How would you balance those? How would you discuss the responsibility for the assassination of Lumumba? And, you know, I mean, we're here in the US and, you know, there's the deflection, but how would you discuss that based upon your research?
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between the demise of the Lumumba government and the assassination. The demise of the government in the summer of '60, so very shortly after independence, after Lumumba called in United Nations troops because you had a military intervention by Belgian troops, and Belgium was organizing secessions in the Congo, Katanga, very rich province, the Kasai, also very rich. And the Lumumba asked for help from the United Nations to restore law and order and to have the Belgian troops out. Now, from the moment that Lumumba saw that the United Nations leadership was playing into the hands of the Belgians and the Americans, because you got the Belgians who wanted to keep under control the wealth of the Congo and wanted for that to do away with Lumumba. And you have also a heavy involvement of the United States, because the United States is the main imperial power in the world at that time, was very worried if Lumumba in the center of Africa, which all the wealth of the country could succeed in a national democratic evolution, and the development of that country, that would have huge consequences for the complete continent, going from the copper belt from the Congo down to Zimbabwe, Zambia, Rhodesia, which still had not its independent. You had all the Portuguese colonies which were still there, and down the copper belt down to the south till in South Africa, where the apartheid regime was in place. So if Lumumba would succeed, this would have provoke enormous convulsions in the complete continent. And this was the reason why the Americans were taking sides with the Belgians, and through the leadership of the United Nations, they were fighting the Lumumba government, and they did everything they could to have him deposed. After the deposition of Lumumba, after he was captured by troops, by Mobutu, and put into a cell near the capital where he was guarded by some elite troops from Mobutu, at that moment, the US and the CIA stopped their operations. They thought the problem was solved. And so you had the CIA, who had a special secret unit, the ZR rifle, which was engaged into assassination plots throughout the world. They called back their asset. They thought the problem of Lumumba has been solved. At the beginning of '61, when the partisans of Lumumba were reorganizing in the East and were beginning a military offensive to take back control of the country, and in a lapse of time, which was very short, a few weeks, they were taking up to 1/4, 1/3 of the country, and you had the army barracks in and around the capital, which were very in rebellion, which were organizing strikes. There were small mutinies, and even in the army barracks where Lumumba was kept guarded, soldiers were demanding the liberation of Lumumba. And then you had a panic broken out in the West. The Americans had no asset on the ground to deal with the problem, and you had the Belgians who had everywhere into the Congo their secret agents, their functionaries, their militaries, and they took responsibility for the transfer to Katanga from Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito. Why did they do that? The easiest thing to do away with the problem of Lumumba was to assassinate him into his cell of Mobutu. Now that had two problems with it. The first one was that this would mean that there would come blood into the hands of the Kasavubu Mobutu regime, which was at that time in place, and Kasavubu had just been elected by the United Nations General Assembly, become the official representative of the Congo. So that would be diplomatically a very bad thing for the West, that their stooge, may I say, would have the blood of Lumumba on his hands. A second problem was that killing Lumumba in his cell could trigger a general rebellion of the army barracks, and it could topple the regime. So they were looking for a subcontractor, and the subcontractor was founded in Katanga, where there was an agreement between the United Nations troops and the Belgian troops, which controlled Katanga, that the airport was divided into two sections, one section for the United Nations, another section controlled by the Belgians, and I could depose Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito without any problem onto the Belgian side of the airport, and that has been done under the eyes of Swedish blue helmets. The three were deposed there. They were taken under control of Belgian army officers, and on the 17th of January, Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito lived for another 4 years, 4 hours, more or less, 4 hours during which they were heavily tortured by black opposants, also by Belgian officers, and finally shot, executed not far away from the Katangese capital. Now, the role of the African opposition on Lumumba at that time was extremely small. When you read the reports about the position of Mobutu, Mobutu was, as has been said by one of the top UN officials, was the weakest strong man which he had ever seen. Mobutu was someone who drank nearly 1 bottle of whiskey a day. He was completely under the control of the Western forces, of United Nations officers. I spoke myself to CIA Chief of Station Larry Devlin, who explained me how he controlled Mobutu, how he was organizing so-called attacks on Mobutu, but to hold them back just in the end, just to prove to Mobutu that he had no other option than to be controlled and to be led by CIA and by Western forces. So I think the idea of seeing people like Mobutu or seeing like the president of Katanga, Tshombe, as people with real power at the time, I don't think that is true. If you read the report, for example, by the assistant of the Secretary General of the UN at the time, he said of the official Katangese president, Tshombe, he said, Tshombe, he doesn't take any decision. All the decisions are being made by Belgian officers. And if they weren't Belgian officers, there would be no Katangese secession at all. It is only later on when we think about dictator Mobutu that we are reinterpreting the situation we know of that dictatorship into the situation of 60, and that we think that their position was quite strong, but this isn't true. All the documents show very clearly that those people at that time were extremely weak and were following the guidance of the West.
Exactly.
Thank you, Dr. De Witte. Dr. Nzongola, did you want to add before we go to Dr. Dworkin?
No, really, only to support what Professor De Witte has said. As I pointed out earlier, that Katanga was an état d'opérette, was a caricatural state, and the fact that Mobutu was basically, a stooge of Mr. Devlin, the CIA station master in Kinshasa.
Thank you, Doc. Well, I did want to ask Dr. De Witte one last question about the legacy of damage that those assassinations have caused the DRC, Africa, and really the world, especially within your eco-socialism model. Could you briefly speak to that legacy? And I know it's like you have the catastrophe. Could you briefly describe it? My apologies for that.
Yeah, well, actually, the legacy was devastating. When you say liquidation of Lumumba, you say assassination of Mobutu, coming to power of the Mobutu dictatorship. Why was that? Belgium never has prepared a national elite to take over the reins of the country after independence. Belgium was like Professor Ngonzola said, was a country where you had no real independent education, you had no liberty of forming trade unions, political parties. It only started very shortly before independence. So the consequence was that the victory of Lumumba was a Pyrrhic victory. It was a victory, but it didn't have the time to really develop a strong party, a strong party cadre which could lead the country. And just to give you one example, 4 of the ministers and state secretaries and collaborators, head of cabinets of the Lumumba government, 4 of them were informants of the Belgian Secret Service. This shows you the weakness of this coalition government. And what happened once when Lumumba and Mpolo and Okito were assassinated, and a few days later, when 7 other central leaders of the MNC, of his party, were assassinated, you had actually the complete summit of the nationalist movement, which was assassinated, was liquidated. And so at that time, there wasn't a civil structure in place which could control and develop the country. And the only thing in the end which could keep together the country, that huge country with all those different peoples, were military boots. And this has been produced in '65. Why in '65? Because in the masses, in the population, the longing for a real independence, the longing for sovereignty, for control of its own resources, kept alive, and it provoked all those rebellions in '63, '64, and the West needed a massive intervention. '64, basically with Belgian officers, with mercenaries, with CIA personnel, and a CIA air flotilla to crush in a river of blood this rebellion, and to atomize completely the population. And this was setting the stage for the coming to power of Mobutu, which produced this dictatorship, which would completely kill the country for the next 30 years.
Thank you, Dr. De Witte. Dr. Dworkin, you're going to bring us home, and I wanted to refocus this a little bit, draw back the lens to more Pan-African focus and bring in the diaspora. And looking at the Haitian Revolution, you know, several historians, they note the importance of Congolese rebels, Maroons, almost whole armies whom the French describe, you know, it's sometimes, according to them, pejoratively, as the Congos. But largely because of the infusion of Congolese people in the Congo and Angolan conflicts. What, if we could think about that as a frame, what did Congolese people and culture contribute to African diasporic liberation movements?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think certainly we need to think about the importance of diaspora and do it in certainly in terms of from position of the Americas and really broadly hemispheric terms. You know, there's a lot that's been done on this and sort of thinking about sites, as you mentioned, Haiti, but also work that's been done on Brazil and in the United States as well. So folks might look at Linda Haywood's book, Central Africans and the Cultural Transformation in the Americas, which is an excellent essay collection, which sort of talks about this among these different locations. And I think Jason Young's book, Rituals of Resistance, as well, thinks about, and I think maybe this is maybe a really useful kind of answer to your, or sort of preliminary answer, at least, to your question, which is thinking about the ways that sort of Congo religion provided both the institutional and the kind of intellectual basis for opposing slavery in the Americas. And this is part of one of the sort of foundational things that sort of Young has written about. And there's a lot of other cases. There's certainly the well-known case of the figure, well-known figure of Congo Jack, who's responsible really for circulating news of the Haitian Revolution throughout the sort of British colonies of the West Indies in the late 18th century. And so certainly the history and the relationship of Congo to various rebellions and uprisings and other forms of kind of more broader forms of kind of cultural resistance, the kinds of things that I think Young and others have written about, is really incredibly important, really kind of foundational for thinking about this kind of landscape. One other thing that I think I might add to this conversation, if I would as well, is in thinking about earlier eras, and certainly there are earlier eras, a number of the African Americans who spent time in the Congo in the late 19th and early 20th centuries work as missionaries. The best known of them, of course, is William Shepherd, but there are also others like the Edmistons. And these are figures who are generally much less well known at the time, and certainly today, were not really well known nationally in many cases. Certainly Shepherd had a platform and a relationship with the national NAACP, but many of the African-American missionaries did not. And so what that meant, and we can think about the Edmiston family, and there's a brand new book by the historian Kimberly Hill on the Edmistons, which I would recommend people look at. But there's a broad number of them. And so part of that trajectory is that we have folks who are incredibly important in their local communities, right? And so that might mean for the Edmistons, their church in Selma, Alabama, and it might mean at Talladega College, and it might mean at Stillman and Tuscaloosa and Fisk University. And through these really important networks of churches and HBCUs and other networks of the Black press, in that what you have is you have a really important kind of grassroots circulation, grassroots networks through which ideas and information and politics about the Congo circulate. So just to make one example, if we can think about the sort of great scholar St. Clair Drake, who was from Stanton, Virginia, and which is also where William Henry Shepherd is from. He talks about meeting Shepherd when he was quite young. This is in the 1920s. Shepherd recommends he goes to Hampton, which he does. And Drake had grown up in a Garveyite family as well. But Drake taught and worked for a number of years in Ghana as a university professor and administrator. Right after independence in Ghana for several years. And he's someone who also kind of comes out of a very particular kind of political, has a formative political understanding of the Congo. And it's something that he sort of is able to, put into a very particular practice in the early years of, what we see in the early years of African independence. And I think there's a lot of sort of people and networks that I think we want to really kind of think about as part of this conversation.
Thank you for that. And if we could focus a little bit more, in your book, Congo, a Love Song, you paint a very vivid picture of Congolese and African diasporic engagement. How do you see the interconnections between these histories? How interconnected are the histories of the Congolese people and African diasporic people?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a number of, it's a story that I think, like my response to the last question, really has a lot of tentacles. And I think one way of thinking about, or one maybe useful sort of story that's worth sort of talking about in this context, and I think it's important when we're thinking about, particularly in the kind of US kind of America's context, is really acknowledging the central role played by Black women in organizing around the Congo. And so here, I think we can look to centrally the example in the work of the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage as a really important organization in the United States that was involved in advocating on behalf of Lumumba. So this is an organization, so even before, well, I should say, this is in late January, so before news of Lumumba's assassination sort of circulated widely, they were petitioning, and this is led by the singer Abby Lincoln, actually organized a petition to have Lumumba released. And she sent this to Jallo Telly, who was at that time was Sekou Touré's representative of the United Nations from Guinea-Conakry, later head of the OAU and had a close relationship with Malcolm X, a few years later. So these are folks who are organizing in the US, and a lot of that organizing as well, part of that story, maybe going back to the sort of idea of the importance of Pan-Africanism, the presence of a number of important African diplomats at the United Nations in the early years of independence are an important part of this story as well, because it provides networks and connections. So the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage is involved in this. Once the news breaks, it breaks in New York on February 13th, 1961, that Lumumba and his comrades had been assassinated, that Maya Angelou, Abbey Lincoln, and Rosa Guy give a speech in front of Louis Michaud's bookstore in Harlem, announcing that there will be a demonstration at the United Nations on February 15th. And that February 15th action is incredibly, incredibly important. It's an action that brings together African Americans and other diasporic Africans, in New York around the figure of Lumumba and his assassination. And there's a disruption that occurs when Adlai Stevenson is speaking in the from the gallery, when Adlai Stevenson is speaking to the United Nations, that is really transformative in many, many ways. And the people who were there in attendance, I mentioned some of the organizers, but Amiri Baraka was there, Askia Mohammed Touré was there, Aisha Rahman was there, Dan Watts of the Liberation Committee for Africa was there, Max Roach, Larry Neal, all of these figures who are really central to the emergence of the Black arts movement, which we can kind of understand as the cultural wing of the Black Power movement. And one of the things and one of the legacies that, again, I really want to sort of highlight that sort of comes out of this is that you have institutions that are born in this period, so 1960 to 1961, and these are sustaining institutions that we see develop and flourish in really, really important ways, throughout the 1960s. So one example would be the Liberation Committee on Africa, headed by Daniel Watts, which was established in June of 1960. And they published their first issue of the journal, The Liberator, in March 1961. The first issue is all about Lumumba. And Christopher Tinson's book, Radical Intellect, is something to get more of the history of that organization and journal that I encourage folks to look at. Baraka's organization, On Guard for Freedom, which has its first issue, which is also focused on Lumumba, comes out around that time as well. Freedom Ways publishes its first issue in the spring of 1961, and they reprint Nkrumah's UN speech about Lumumba in its issue as well. And these are institutions and organizations that are really sustaining and critical tools over a number of, really for a number of years. Just a couple of other points to wrap out this history that I think are maybe relevant. One is that after that February 15th action, Maya Angelou and Rosa Guy go to meet Malcolm X and have a discussion with Malcolm X, and he's somewhat critical about some of the tactics. This is in 1961, but Malcolm's own politics, he was very interested in Lumumba, we know, going back to the previous year when he met with Castro. But this is one important connection. And the other one that I should point out as well is that one of the things that we see, and this is why those publications and organizations are so important, is that Ralph Bunche, who was the head of the UN sort of Congo mission at that point, spoke harshly and critically about the protesters at the UN on February 15th. And he was supported in this, I should say, by Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Lester Granger of the Urban League. NAACP's crisis sort of talk about it as talk about the violence of the demonstration. And what we saw then is the need for other forms of organizing that weren't necessarily being addressed at that moment. And we can talk about maybe what happens a little bit later, but by some of the sort of mainstream and legacy sort of civil rights organizations around this issue, right? And so that's one of the moments when we see those organizations and the kind of print culture, right? The newspapers and publishing houses and things that emerge out of that moment. And Lumumba, again, the sort of legacy of Lumumba is really central. And it's, something that I do want us to think about in terms of these kinds of institutions and organizations and figures who are so central. I mean, I could sort of, there's a half dozen other kind of organizations, figures, individuals who are really kind of galvanized at that moment. And that galvanization, I think the other thing I want to say is while they're galvanized by that moment, these are also folks who had been organizing before that, right? So there's something really kind of transformative about that, but it's also building on, established sort of political networks and cultures and infrastructure that a lot of those folks had been involved in previously.
Thank you. Dr. Nzongola? Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question for Ira. I didn't come to the US until 1962, but I heard that the heroine, the leader of that storming of the UN Assembly in February 61 was Ira Kitt. You didn't mention her.
Eartha Kitt, yeah, there's, okay. So there's a number of people, there's a number of folks who we know were there, some folks who may have been there. A lot of the original reports suggested Malcolm was there. I've heard reports that Eartha Kitt was there, but she's not someone who I've confirmed was there. She was certainly someone who aligned with Malcolm and sort of spoke and did speak about the Congo, certainly around 64. May Mallory, a close associate of Robert Williams, was another really important figure who was there, who was accused of doing that. But yeah, but there were a number of folks who were there. I mean, the other thing that I think maybe should mention as well. So after, Ralph Bunche sort of really dismissed, and then I should say the dismissal was not only about the tactics, the dismissal was also that these African Americans were naive, in, their investment in a charlatan such as Lumumba.
Yeah, typical.
I mean, yeah, so some of it was generational, not all of it was. You mentioned, yours mentioned the sort of 1958 Ghana conference. That's where Du Bois, an elder at that point, obviously 90 years old, met Lumumba. And by the fall of 1960, when Lumumba's under house arrest, Du Bois speaks in favor of Lumumba and says, I didn't really kind of understand what he was doing when I first met him in 58, but I get it now. But that's kind of dismissal. And so we see these figures. Oh, and so the thing I was going to add is after Bunche comes out and says that, the two most prominent African-American writers at that point would have been James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry. Both of them came out very publicly. So in March of 61, sort of saying that they support the demonstration, they regret that they were unable to attend. But really, so it becomes a point of tension, right? And and we have those, artists who are sort of thinking about them as well. But Eartha was not someone I again, there's a number of names that I see sort of come up in some of the accounts, and there isn't a sort of from piecing together different accounts. So
thanks.
Which is a good place to begin to actually wrap things up and to open things up for our audience. Yeah, absolutely. But just before we do that, I'm going to conclude by changing the final question slightly. And I guess the final question has to do with how do you repair the damage done by assassinating national leaders? What does that look like to actually to make reparations for the assassination of a Martin Luther King, a Patrice Lumumba, a Maurice Mpolo, Joseph Okito, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, who's born on the exact same day as Lumumba? How do we begin to do that? And I want us to think not just in terms of the appeal, but in terms of how do African people and the allies of African people who are interested in telling the truth and social justice, how do you repair that damage? How do you think through that? Dr. Nzongola, if you could wrap up for us.
Thank you. In that blog I published in the Review of African Political Economy 2 days ago, I have the answer of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon, in his book Toward the African Revolution, has a chapter called about Lumumba's death. Could we have done otherwise? He points out two major mistakes done in the case of the Congo. One was Lumumba's appeal to United Nations to intervene. Now, as you know, as some of you know, Lumumba and Kasavubu went first to the US Embassy, naively speaking, asking the US ambassador to have the United States intervene to kick out the Belgian troops who had invaded the Congo on July 10th, 1960. Ambassador Timberlake, the US ambassador, told him, no, you should call upon the United Nations. The United States can't intervene against a fellow NATO member. And so they dutifully called upon the United Nations. And not knowing or understanding that the United Nations Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish intellectual and diplomat and aristocrat, had the same worldview as the United States government. For him, he saw the struggle in the Congo as a struggle for the West to keep control of Central Africa, and was going to do everything to make sure that Lumumba does not succeed. And yet, we saw the Lumumba called upon the UN to come, thinking the UN is going to help him, when the UN came to weaken him and eventually to participate, to collaborate in his demise. The second point Fanon makes is the mistake made by African states by sending their troops under United Nations supervision. We saw that in the case of Ghana. Ghana was the first country to send troops under UN. As a matter of fact, ironically, they were flown into the Congo in Soviet planes. The Soviet planes brought a Ghanaian contingent in the Congo. But that Ghanaian contingent was under the control of British officers, because Nkrumah, for whatever reasons, had maintained the British officers in command. The General Alexander, who was head of the Ghanaian army, was British. All of the colonels and majors were British, and the Ghanaians came way below. And so General Alexander was known to be one of the most anti-Lumumba officers in the UN force in the Congo, and yet he was there. The same was for the Moroccan general, who was a CIA guy, who actually helped Mobutu stage the coup of September 14. I remember I made a statement to the Moroccans in Rabat in 2011. They were all shocked, and somebody said, "Is that true?" I said, "Oh yeah, I have the evidence." You know, and we're seeing that today. You know, in 2013, the SADC, the Southern African Development Community, decided to send troops in the Congo to end this murderous killing of innocent civilians by military units that have been in the Congo from Uganda, from Rwanda, and Congolese who have been involved in this looting of minerals and so on. We've been killing people. So they decided that to put up troops from 3 countries, South Africa, Malawi, and Tanzania. The United Nations insisted that this force brigade must be placed under the United Nations mission in Congo, MONUSCO. And for some reason, I don't understand, African countries agreed. Now, you know what has happened? The force brigade hasn't done a thing once we got rid of one militia group, what is called, the M23, what is it? Yeah, that group is the only group that the force brigade was able to get rid of. All the others are still there, and nothing has been done because the United Nations has no interest in ending the strife in Eastern Congo, because the corporate giants of this world want to continue looting our resources, and we don't want a peace in the Congo. So these are 2 mistakes. So what is the lesson? The lesson is that we have to rely on our own forces. That is the main lesson.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Nzongola. I appreciate that. Dr. De Witte, you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add something on what Professor Gonzalez said. I don't think that Lumumba had any illusion into the United Nations. What he was thinking was that the so-called Afro-Asian bloc, the people recently independent, would put heavy pressure and would use their force and would use their troops within the United Nations contingent just to come to the aid of the democratically elected Congolese government. And as you said, this is the tragedy of the Congo crisis, that when Lumumba fled to the east to try to reach his supporters after he was deposed as a prime minister. He fell into the hands of Mobutu, thanks to Ghanaian blue helmets. I published the documents in my book, in which you got the Swedish commander-in-chief von Horn, who ordered the Ghanaian officer, which was a British officer, saying you may not protect Lumumba because we know he's running around somewhere and he's being chased by the troops of Mobutu. And at a certain moment, Lumumba arrived at the Ghanaian army barracks. He asked protections. The soldiers wanted to protect him, and the officer said, "No, you have to release him." Exactly. And that's when he fell into the hands of Mobutu. And the result was an army mutiny in the contingent of the Ghanese blue helmets. So I think this is a very important lesson. Part of the lesson of the Congo crisis is that for the first time you had an international engagement of the South, and you had a treason, or at least an exception of the domination of the West by a lot of African newly independent countries.
Exactly.
Dr. Dworkin, what does that, how do you repair that damage from the perspective of somebody who's doing the research on connections with the diaspora?
It's such an important question and a difficult one. I think maybe one sort of footnote I would add to this really important conversation about the United Nations that I think is worth thinking about as well is that, so when Patrice Lumumba, in his efforts to appeal to the United Nations, makes his one trip to the United States and arrives in New York, so this is at the end of July, part of that visit while he's in the US also includes reaching out to African American sort of organizations. So he speaks famously at Howard University during that time as well, in Washington, DC. So it is clear, I think maybe this goes to, I think Professor De Witte's point that Lumumba was not under particular romantic illusions about the United Nations, is that I think certainly from what we can take away from that visit is an understanding of the way that he sort of understood the necessity of those appeals and kind of outreach and organizing taking place on multiple levels at the same time. You know, the other thing I might point out in this context, because you also kind of introduced the idea that, or, you know, it's a sort of correlation that tomorrow is the National Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And so I had mentioned the reaction of some of the mainstream civil rights organizations to the protest at the UN in 1961. The other thing I think I should mention as well, or might mention in this context, is that by November of 1964, on the eve of the actions that took place in Kisangani, a group of the mainstream civil rights organizations actually wrote to President Johnson asking that the US government withdraw all support for Moise Tshombe. This is actually within 24 hours of the sort of US-backed intervention there. And this really marks a significant shift that takes place. So we're talking about this is sort of taking place, 3.5 years later. It's the same organizations. Roy Wilkins, who had signed one of the earlier, is one of the signatories, and along with Martin Luther King, who certainly represents a different trajectory within that sort of group of six who did that. And so I guess part of what I would, and I should say as well, and so this is actually, this is the end of November of 1964. This is actually a couple weeks before King receives the Nobel Peace Prize. So 2 weeks later, he's in Sweden, and he's actually talking about the Congo there. And he calls it a violent harvest. So he understands, certainly King understands it as a cumulative event in that way. And it's a cumulative event that's ramifications would be ongoing in that particular way. So my way of kind of answering or sort of providing one kind of answer to that question is the idea that I do think the kind of sustained organizing and political pressure that younger generations of activists were putting on mainstream organizations during that did shift, did create a shift I think, in the position and the kinds of work that was taking place there. I mean, I think that's a long way before sort of a full accounting and acknowledgement of reparations, but there wasn't an interest in, I think, you know, as again, to go back maybe to Lumumba's inaugural address, it wasn't a Independence Day address. It was not, you know, it was not a investment in the idea that we would put the past behind us and sort of without, you know, having a kind of more thorough accounting and reconciling with that history and its ongoing ramifications.
Okay, I want to thank our three panelists, and please join me in thanking them. You know, it's kind of awkward if I'm giving applause by myself, but believe me, we are applauding you and thanking you for your commitment to truth and to scholar activism. So we want to open it up to our audience. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask for the assistance of Brother Kwadwo, if you can help me to, because my apologies, I have not been able to monitor the Q&A. I've been engrossed in taking my own notes from these three scholars. But if we could begin, let's see if we could scroll through. There's a question. Can the panelists provide any thoughts on the current DRC bearers of the great Lumumba legacy? And in the interest of time, I'm sorry, I'm going to take one question from each person. Does any one person want to speak to that? Dr. Nzongola?
I can only think about like one politician, Frank Diongo, who spent some time in jail under Joseph Kabila, who is one Lumumbist whom I have respect.
I'm sorry. Could I ask you to could you spell his last name for me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Diongo, D-I-O-N-G-O.
Okay, Diongo.
Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, we don't have that many Lumumbis worth the name, unfortunately. Beginning even with his own children, those who are left, we don't really have people who really incarnate the spirit, the thinking, the ideology, the commitment. We just don't have them. That's one of the real tragedies of the Congo as a result of the Mobutu dictatorship and the Kabila dictatorship. You know, the revolutionary forces simply are in very short supply.
Thank you. I think this next one we can direct to Dr. De Witte. What are the major mining companies in the DRC today, and what political interests and or countries are connected to them?
Well, I'm not really a specialist of the situation in the Congo today, but I think basically the project of extracting the wealth of the Congo from the south, from the global south to the north, goes on like it goes on in 60. And just one emblematic example can prove that. We had in 60 the Union Minière, which was a company, a mining company, part of the Société Générale of Belgium, who controlled the Katangese secession, who delivered, by the way, the acid in which the bodies of Lumumba and Mpolo and Okito were dissolved. And this company, the Union Minière, changed its name in Umicore. They did it in the year 2000, at the time when in Belgium there was a parliamentary commission put up to answer the accusations which were put in my book about the Belgian role into the assassination of Lumumba. So there came a PR operation, changing of the name from Union Minière into Umicore, and today it's going on. The only thing is that now the Union Minière is buying its Congolese materials from Glencore, from a Swiss mining company, which works through a lot of middlemen to get the materials attracted out of the Congo. We know at this time, the role of the eastern neighbors of the Congo into that. It's no accident that you have in, for example, in Rwanda, in Kigali, you have suburbs which are called today Merci Congo, thank you Congo, or Colton City. So those countries are those a lot of people are making good money out of that extraction. A lot of the time of illegal operations of extraction of those wealth towards Apple, Mercedes, Umicore, etc. I think there's a lot has been changed, because I think recently, in that sense, that there is more a way of Congolese government to negotiate and to put one element against the other. For example, some Western companies against the Chinese, and when you see, for example, that the taxes on mining products are now were changed from 2.5% during the Kabila time to 10% today. You see a small evolution in the good direction. But I think, if I may so, I think it's important for the Congo not only to have long-term contracts for attraction of material wealth. The Congo has to develop a kind of industry in itself. And there you have the problem that what has been said at a certain moment by a German philosopher, which is not really very popular these days, but who said at a certain moment that the impact of the cheap products produced by productive Western companies are a lot of more devastating than the heavy artillery of cannons. And that is the problem, I think, one of the big problems for the Congo, that the massive concurrence of very cheap products from the outside world inhibits the development of an industry in its own. And this necessitates a kind of barriers, a kind of monopoly, a kind of protective wall around these industries. But this is a big fight. I remember that when Laurent Désiré Kabila came to power after the toppling of Mobutu, he tried to impose a kind of state control on financial transactions, and you had immediately a huge outcry in the Western world about this, that this was a way of getting to a kind of communist system, etc. So you see that before you can implement those elements, those steps to go ahead, you have to build relationship of forces, that you have the support of your population, that you have some kind of international support just to impose that and to fight the resistance which will come from Western companies and their governments.
Thank you. This next question, it seems ready-made for Dr. Dworkin. It's, are there any connections between Patrice Lumumba and Malcolm X's nationalism, which I think has been touched on, especially in terms of the role of the media? What are some of the lessons we could draw from these two cases? Is there anything else that you wanted to say, add to what you've already said, Dr. Dworkin?
Sure. I mean, it's an important question and a rich topic, and one that I think could say a lot to. I mean, as I mentioned before, Malcolm was deeply interested in the Congo for a number of years. And what we start to see, sort of the depth of that really expands in 1964, when he spends a good part, a majority of that year outside of the United States, much of it in Africa. And he's traveling and meeting African diplomats and folks like that. And one of the sort of, what we know is that one of the sort of constant topics of conversation that he's experiencing there or encountering is talk about Lumumba, talk about the Congo, particularly the deepening sort of neo-colonial actions that are threatening Kisangani. And this is a part of what he's engaged in. A lot of the folks who become his most trusted allies, so I know that Professor Nzongola was talking about his article in the Review of African Political Economy, which talks about, I believe you mentioned Mohamed Babu, who was a ally and supporter of Lumumba, who was also someone who was Malcolm X was quite close to during his travels in Africa, and later when Babu spends time in the United States at the end of 1964. And so these connections are incredibly important. In terms of the media, I mean, one of the things that Malcolm is quite consistent in his speeches and writings about the Congo is that there is a very deliberate strategy that's taking place within white mainstream US press that's creating a very particular anti-Congolese narrative. And that which they tell you that, and he's, says that they tell you that, the freedom fighters are not the freedom fighters, and sort of basically they've completely flipped the script on that kind of entire narrative. And he understands it as being really something that's kind of deeply systematic in terms of the way that the lies that people are effectively being told about what's going on there. I mean, I should mention as well, I mean, there's a number of other things. So one thing I also will mention is that Malcolm's deep interest in the Congo is certainly part of this broader story of Pan-Africanism, in which is something that he and Malcolm certainly shared. The other thing, I mean, one of the other things I would mention without going into too much detail is we start to see increase and expanded Black newspaper coverage, or I won't go into it now, Black newspaper coverage around the Congo and around Lumumba. And again, this is something that Malcolm's talking about a lot. I mean, I think part of what happens within the US discourse, so this is Malcolm X was assassinated in February of 1965. So this is amid this kind of deepening interest in the Congo. But this is also the time when the US is expanding its own involvement in Vietnam, right? And so that what happens is, I think, that within sort of discourses about the US's involvement in imperialist endeavors, what we start to see is Vietnam taking up a lot of media space, certainly as it should. But there's a displacement of the Congo, and I wonder if Malcolm had sort of continued to be able to sort of talk about it and make connections between Vietnam and the Congo, what that would have, one of the things, maybe we can begin to think about what that would have looked like. The other thing I'll just mention, in passing, there's a whole litany of media, particularly poetry of the Black arts movement, that pair works by Jane Cortez and others that pair Malcolm X and Patrice Lumumba in very, very specific terms. And that's something that we see as well. So it's that connection that the sort of questioner is pointing at is something that I think was really well recognized by Black activists, intellectuals, and artists of that era, and sort of really took that relationship to be central to their own sort of cultural project.
Thank you. The next question, well, I'm going to put it out here. This is a question which is, what is the significance of the return of Lumumba's remains to the DRC? What is the significance, if any, of Lumumba Square in Brussels? Any, Dr. De Witte, Dr. Nzongola, would you like to address?
Ask Ludo.
Okay.
You come from Brussels.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm involved into the stuff in that sense that actually I was shocked when, after the publication of my book, you had the Lumumba Commission and the Belgian police officer showed remains of Lumumba to some journalists, and the Lumumba Commission didn't intervene. The Lumumba Commission had all the powers to have a house search and to have a confiscation of those things. They didn't do that. It's really unbelievable. And it was in 2016, I got a phone call from a journalist who went to speak with the daughter of that Belgian police officer. And he said, well, that woman very, without thinking about it, they showed me the remains of they showed the heritage of her father, and there was a tooth in it. So I went directly to a police station. I filed a complaint, and I said that I would make a lot of media stuff when there wouldn't be some action by the judiciary. And so out of that, there was a house search, and the tooth has been confiscated by Belgian justice. Now, in the meantime, Belgian justice has said that the tooth was integrated into the dossier, l'enquête. You know that the Lumumba family has introduced a complaint against 12 Belgians who were involved into the assassination of Lumumba. And the judge was working on this integrated the remains they found in the house into that stuff. Now, in the summer, they dissociated the two dossiers and they said, well, the Lumumba family can come and get the tooth. They did it in an ignoble way. You had just an official declaration made, a press declaration by the Belgian justice system saying that the family can come to the Brussels justice to come to get the packet, as if it's a kind of a vulgar lost object, like a lost wallet or a lost watch. It's really unbelievable. But in the meantime, and this is very important, we had the fallout of the George Floyd assassination. And we had really a huge Black Lives Matter manifestation in Brussels, and this had a lot of. This has really shaken the Belgian establishment, and a part of it is I think is the decision to liberate the remains of Lumumba and to give it back. In the meantime, there seems to be an agreement between the Lumumba family, between President Tshisekedi, to organize the repatriation of the remains of Lumumba to the Congo for the 3rd of June this year, donc at the anniversary of the independence of the Congo, and there would be erected a kind of mausoleum. In the meantime, we are trying with a lot of Afro-Belgian associations and other activists to get a profound political element into it by trying also to get the Congolese government to ask back the founding document of the independent Congo, that is the speech of Patrice Lumumba, the original speech, which has been annotated by him during the ceremony of independence while the king was giving his paternalistic speech. We have found, and I wrote an article about that, we have found a copy of that in one of the archives of the Société Générale. So we have to go into the archives of the Société Générale, which is a huge archive, tons and tons of meters, to get this original document. So we want to bring back Lumumba to the Congo, and in the meantime, we wanted to have a kind of a political aspect of it, which can be important just for educating about the life and work of Lumumba, that he becomes an inspiration for the work of new generations of Congolese.
Okay, I'm going to actually, we have a couple of other questions, but in the interest of making sure that we allow time for Friends of the Congo, I wanted to bring Brother Kwame Wilburg on, and he is the local head of the Friends of the Congo Atlanta chapter that is hosting. And I wanted to thank also all the members of Friends of the Congo, especially Brother Maurice Carney and Brother Kwame and Sister Patricia Servant, who really provide an excellent focus for us. And I want to thank our panelists one more time, but if Brother Kwame, if you could come on and talk about some upcoming events and And also note, just recapitulate that point about the appeal for the Lumumba Day, and you know, kind of give us our marching orders as we walk away with our bellies full of information, our heads full of information. What do you see as, what are our marching orders?
Well, greetings. It's good to be here with the panelists. I want to thank them for that one very wonderful and important presentation on the life and legacy of Patrice Lumumba. I just want to also salute not only Friends of the Congo, but the tremendous amount of work that's been done by fraternal formations to make sure that Lumumba's work doesn't die, but indeed gains momentum. And also, you know, in sync with Dr. King's work. Very important connections at this time. So you mentioned in terms of some of the events coming up next month in February, that is African History Month, Black History Month, we want to have a conversation between the youth in the Congo and also the youth in the United States and elsewhere in the Pan-African world. Because as we understand, as we remember, Lumumba's message to the youth of the world, that, you know, it's their legacy to carry forward. And we were inspired as you spoke about the presence of Lumumba in popular culture and elsewhere across the world. So in February, we will be hosting such an event. In March, of course, it's Women's History Month, and we understand the tremendous burden on the women of the DRC, but also the tremendous contribution to keeping alive the struggle for liberation. So in the spirit of Kempavita and Nzinga, we will be looking at their contributions today. And of course, in April, the lingering legacy of the Rwandan genocide, we want to look at the Pan-African implications of that, the regional and global implications, the unfinished impact of that situation. In May, of course, African Liberation Month, we will be hosting a traditional, participating in the annual ALD activities at the end of May. In June, of course, the day, the African Child, the connections with South Africa and beyond. And as we know, the South African comrades and friends are also very involved in this work of liberation. And as Pan-Africanists, of course, you know, we understand it's beyond the colonial borders. So yes, the Day of the African Child is a very important work for us with Friends of the Congo. In July, we remember that both Medgar Evers and Patrice Lumumba share birthdays. And so it's really a kind of serendipitous moment that we have. Last year, if my comrades can correct me, was the inaugural commemoration of that event in collaboration with First African Church in Atlanta and several other formations, saluting the great work being done in Jackson, Mississippi by folks in Malcolm X grassroots, and you know, that very critical work done there. Understanding the connection between Mississippi and the Congo, as was referenced, Malcolm pointed out that in order to understand what's happening in Mississippi, we need to understand what's happening in the Congo, the global reach of imperialism. And of course, towards the latter part of the year, Congo Week in October, very exciting to look forward to, because one of the potential awardees being considered, well-deserved, might be Lumumba's daughter herself. And then that should take us to the end of the year. But again, there's ongoing work in between those events. I certainly want to salute the work of the panelists, the work of my comrades and friends in the Friends of the Congo, and the fraternal formations, too many to list. The First African Church, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, MXGM, And I'm sure you probably will remember a few more, Brother Samuel. So big respect to everyone, and that's all for now. Thank you so much for keeping the legacy of Patrice Lumumba alive.
Thank you, Brother Kwame. I think we had Sister Sarah who wanted to, or not who wanted to, but we wanted to come up and just to reemphasize a couple of key points from the appeal, and then we're going to close out. Sister Sarah?
No,
I don't think she's here. Oh, no, she is. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
yes.
Okay. On the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Joseph Okito, and Maurice Mpolo, Congolese Pan-Africanists and people of goodwill throughout the globe have launched a campaign to declare January 17th as Lumumba Day. Colonial and imperialist forces in cahoots with Congolese elites conspired to overthrow and subsequently assassinate Congo's first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Emery Lumumba. Lumumba was singled out for a particular brutal and pernicious murder. He was gunned down by a firing squad, followed by the dismemberment of his body, which was later dissolved in acid. One of the Belgian soldiers responsible for dissolving Lumumba's body parts took one of his teeth as a trophy. The intent of the forces involved, such as Belgium, United States, and the United Nations, was to erase Lumumba and the leadership of his nationalist and Pan-Africanist government from memory. Generations later, Congolese youth, Africans, Pan-Africanists, working class folks throughout the globe, and people of goodwill have declared that Lumumba's physical body was distinguished, but his ideas, teachings, and spirit will live forever. Lumumba's call for self-sufficiency, self-determination, and African liberation has been embraced by a new generation of Congolese and Africans. We appeal to justice-seeking and peace-loving people throughout the world to commemorate January 17th each year as Lumumba Day by taking any or all of the following actions. A, securing a resolution from your organization or government declaring January 17th as Lumumba Day. B, screening a film on Lumumba. C, sharing information about Lumumba on social media. D, participating in a Lumumba commemoration events. E, supporting Congolese and African youth carrying on the Pan-African ideals and legacy of Lumumba.
Thank you, Sister Sarah. So if you're wondering, well, how do I get more information? You can visit friendsofthecongo.org. And I mean, I know there are a lot of formations. Hopefully you've connected with someone in the chat, and hopefully you've taken some information that will inform how we think about, who are our leaders. Our leaders cannot be just isolated within one nation. So please take that opportunity to visit friendsofthecongo.org. There are a number of taking action items and more information. And that's the key thing. So you can see the links to the books, the works of Dr. George Nzongola-Ntalaja, Dr. Ludo De Witte, and Brother Ira Dworkin. And I want to also say that we discuss the works as well. So Dr. Nzongola's work, we is a part of the Congo curriculum, and we are incorporating Dr. Dworkin's Congo Love Song into that curriculum as well. And we look forward to doing the same thing with Dr. De Witte's work. So if you want to join us in our study groups, we would definitely welcome you. But I'm not going to take more time, Brother Kwame. Please rescue me if I'm forgetting something. And that's the dangerous part of having me close out, because my brain has just been fried by all this great information. But is there anything else, Brother Kwadwo or Brother Kwame or Sister Tyra, that we should remind the audience before we close out?
Great job, Brother Samori. Much thanks.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate y'all. Of course, this is the work. I have to salute Brother Kwadwo, Danso for doing just phenomenal work of organizing, and Brother Maurice Carney, Sister Tyra, everybody in Friends of the Congo, but especially Friends of the Congo Atlanta. And just really looking forward to making more connections with everybody. And hopefully Dr. De Witte, Dr. Nzongola, and Dr. Dworkin, you will hear from your increasing fan club as people try to reach out to you and get more information. But I think that's it for now. I'm going to close out and thank everyone. And till our next time, Lumumba lives, his legacy lives. Lumumba Day, remember, take it to your organization, and let's see if we can build that support. Thank you, everyone, in African unity and victory.
Okay, thank
Thank you.
Bon, merci.
See you.
Okay, see you.
One super final note. Just a quick shout out to all of the youth in the DRC right now, the Telema movement, as well as the youths who are working in the Andre Blouin Center to continue advocating and advancing the teachings of Patrice Lumumba to build and develop an independent, liberated, anti-colonial Congo. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care now.
Good night.